You begin with an assumption so familiar that you rarely notice it. You believe that knowing more brings you closer to truth. You rely on reasoning as if its reliability is self-evident. The sense of clarity feels like confirmation, and the absence of doubt feels like certainty. Yet the structure of this confidence has never been carefully examined. You trust the process of thinking because thinking is all you have ever known. Al-Ghazali enters this moment early. He recognizes that confidence in knowledge is often inherited rather than verified. He points out that the mind does not question the instrument it uses to reach every conclusion. You are left with a quiet but pressing question. If the mind is the judge of truth, who judges the mind? Al-Ghazali lived in a world where intellect appeared sovereign. Scholars, jurists, theologians, philosophers, and mystics filled the intellectual spaces of Baghdad. Debate was the primary measure of insight, and mastery of argument was seen as mastery of truth. Every discipline claimed certainty, each with its own method of reasoning. From within this environment, Al-Ghazali noticed something subtle yet decisive. The presence of many confident voices does not guarantee any of them are correct. When each group claims authority, disagreement becomes the only shared language. This observation provokes a deeper question. Can truth be located in argument alone? Al-Ghazali's confidence in the intellect begins to tremble when he examines the foundations of each discipline. Empirical knowledge depends on senses that can mislead. Rational deduction depends on premises it cannot prove. Theological claims depend on interpretations shaped by prior assumptions. Each path, when viewed carefully, exposes a form of dependence on something uncertain. You begin to see the same fragility in your own thinking. The conclusions you defend with confidence may rest on principles you never personally established. When the desire for certainty pushes you to test every foundation, you recognize a difficult truth. Reason cannot guarantee the reality of the very premises it uses to reason. The crisis is not emotional, it is structural. You often trust your senses as the first layer of knowledge. You believe that what you see, hear, or feel gives you direct access to reality. But when you examine this assumption with care, you recognize that perception does not offer truth. It offers interpretation. What you call seeing is shaped by expectation, habit, and selective attention. New information routinely corrects old perceptions, revealing that what appeared certain was only provisional. Al-Ghazali noticed this long before the language of psychology or cognitive science. He observed that perception establishes itself as authority simply because it arrives first. When later reasoning contradicts earlier perception, you do not treat the early perception as deliberate deception. You simply say it was incomplete. This observation shifts the inquiry. If perception is unstable and if experience can be reinterpreted at any moment, then no sensory impression can serve as a final foundation for truth. You begin to ask a different kind of question. If perception changes as understanding grows, how can you trust perception to reveal what does not change? Reason alone cannot answer this. It depends on perception to supply the very information it analyzes. Here the instability of perception becomes the boundary of reason. When perception proves unreliable, you turn to the mind as a more disciplined source of certainty. You hope that logic, structure, and coherence can compensate for the shifting nature of experience. Yet Al-Ghazali identifies another subtle problem. The mind often produces the feeling of clarity long before it secures the reality of clarity. The sensation of understanding is not evidence of understanding. You begin noticing how often you mistake coherence for truth. A thought seems consistent, so you accept it. An argument sounds rigorous, so you trust it. But coherence is internal to the thought itself. It does not guarantee alignment with reality. A system of ideas can be perfectly logical and completely false. Al-Ghazali emphasizes that the mind's greatest deception is not error but comfort. Thought becomes convincing because it satisfies itself. The mind prefers a completed argument to an unresolved one. This preference shapes conclusions long before inquiry has ended. You start to see that much of what you once considered knowledge was simply the mind agreeing with its own patterns. This realization deepens the crisis of certainty. If both perception and reasoning generate convincing impressions without guaranteeing truth, then the source of certainty must lie beyond both. The question becomes unavoidable. If clarity can be fabricated, what distinguishes insight from self-approval? Al-Ghazali eventually articulates a boundary that reason cannot cross. Reason can analyze relationships between ideas, compare evidence, refine distinctions, and expose contradictions. It can reveal mistakes in perception and inconsistencies in belief. But reason cannot justify its own first principles. It cannot explain why it trusts logic or why certain axioms feel self-evident. You see that reason assumes the reliability of its own structure without proving it. This assumption is unavoidable, yet unverified. Reason functions within a framework it cannot examine from the outside. When you ask reason to provide the ground of its own authority, it can only repeat the patterns it is built upon. This is the door reason cannot open. It is not a deficiency in intelligence but a structural limit. Reason is powerful precisely because it operates within clear boundaries. Its strength becomes weakness when it attempts to transcend them. When you understand this, you experience a different kind of stillness. Reason does not fail. It simply acknowledges the limit beyond which it cannot proceed. What lies beyond that limit is not irrational. It is simply not accessible through reasoning alone. Here the inquiry shifts from expansion to refinement. You stop trying to force reason past its boundary and begin exploring what kind of awareness emerges when reason becomes quiet. Once the limit of reason becomes clear, a new state appears: suspension. It is not confusion or despair. It is the recognition that further reasoning will not resolve the fundamental question. The mind continues to think, but it no longer expects thought to reach certainty. You begin to see the cycle. Thought examines thought, doubt examines doubt, and certainty remains elusive. The more intensely you search through thought, the more you encounter repetition rather than revelation. Al-Ghazali describes this turning point with precision. When reasoning reaches its limit, the seeker does not collapse into disbelief. Instead, the seeker recognizes that truth may not be produced by thinking. Thought can prepare the mind, refine its structure, and clear away errors, but it cannot generate what lies beyond its own form. This insight reshapes your inquiry. You are no longer searching for a conclusion that fits your current framework. You are observing the framework itself. Doubt becomes a discipline, not a failure. You suspend the instinct to resolve the question prematurely. You begin to allow the possibility that certainty might arrive not through an act of the mind but through the unveiling of awareness. The paradox becomes sharper. If thinking cannot grasp the ground of truth, what mode of perception can? This question does not seek a verbal answer. It shifts the center of inquiry from thought to awareness. What emerges after suspension is neither argument nor inference. It is a form of clarity that is not constructed. Al-Ghazali identifies it as a direct awareness that reveals itself when the mind becomes transparent. It does not replace reason, it precedes it. It provides the foundation reason cannot provide for itself. You begin to notice this form of knowing in moments where clarity arrives without steps. There is no chain of reasoning to create it, yet it feels more stable than any conclusion produced by logic. It is not emotional intuition or personal preference. It is a perception of truth that does not depend on thought to validate it. Al-Ghazali explains that this awareness becomes accessible only when desire, fear, and attachment are suspended. These internal distortions shape reasoning and perception, making the mind seek what it prefers rather than what is true. When these influences quiet down, awareness reveals what the mind was unable to reach through effort. This transformation is not dramatic. It is sober and precise. You realize that certainty is not obtained but recognized. It appears when the obstacles to seeing are removed. Reason organizes what this awareness reveals, but it cannot produce the revelation itself. In this stage, you understand why the door reason cannot open is not unlocked by force. It opens when the need to force it disappears. The shift is subtle but decisive. Certainty becomes something you witness, not something you manufacture. The final insight does not reject reason. Instead, it restores reason to its proper role. Reason becomes clear and reliable precisely when it no longer claims to be the ultimate source of certainty. Al-Ghazali emphasizes that reason is indispensable for organizing thought, evaluating evidence, and avoiding error. But when reason tries to establish the foundation of truth, it steps outside its capacity. Once you recognize this, the confusion between reasoning and reality begins to dissolve. You begin using reason differently. You no longer expect it to deliver what it cannot provide. You rely on it to clarify what awareness reveals, not to generate revelation itself. This repositioning produces a clarity that was previously inaccessible. Thought no longer tries to defend itself. It becomes a tool rather than an identity. This is the stage where the paradox resolves conceptually. Reason becomes most trustworthy when it recognizes its own limits. Understanding becomes most stable when it arises from awareness rather than argument. The search for certainty no longer depends on accumulating information but on removing the distortions that prevent awareness from functioning. You realize that the crisis of knowledge was not a loss but a passage. It allowed reason to refine itself and step aside at the point where it could no longer proceed. In doing so, it made space for a different kind of certainty, one that is not opposed to reason but completes it. At the end of this inquiry, you encounter a form of stillness that is not emptiness but clarity. You understand what Al-Ghazali discovered. When the mind stops insisting that truth must appear through reasoning, truth becomes available without resistance. Awareness reveals what thought could not produce. This is not the rejection of intellect. It is the final refinement of intellect. The search concludes not with a conclusion but with a recognition. Truth does not belong to the thinker. It is revealed when the thinker no longer claims ownership. When the questioning mind becomes quiet, what remains is certainty without argument. And in that stillness, the door that reason could not open is already open.